So this is 14E restrictions on our new rules. In the previous video, I introduced the new primitive rules, and I said that there's some binding restrictions on the rules, and I want to say a little bit about how those are. I'm not actually going to describe them in full detail. There are restrictions on both EI and UI and EG, and I'm only going to look at the way they work with UI. Because they work basically the same with EG, and command mode is going to keep you from messing these up. So you still want to have an understanding of how they work, because otherwise you might try to do things that command mode won't let you do. It's not critical that you sort of, again, as I was saying before about binding, you don't have to have a super great understanding of this right away, but you need to begin to understand it right now. So, okay. So here's the first restriction, is that you have to replace all of the variables that are bound by the quantifier. So suppose I have for all x, if ex, then hx. So every emu chirps. So that means, so here's an okay instance. If Alfred is an emu, then Alfred chirps. Now, maybe he's not an emu, but if he is, then he chirps. This is a good use of UI. Suppose I said for all x if ex and cx, then if ex then ca. So then I'd be saying if Xavier is an emu, then Alfred chirps. Now, that might be true, but that's not what the premise says. The premise says if you're an emu, then you chirp. It says of each thing, if that thing is an emu, then that very same thing chirps. And this conclusion doesn't say that. So this is not okay. And the problem with doing it is that we replaced the x and cx with an a, but we didn't replace the x and ex with an a. So all of the variables that the quantifier binds, they get replaced by the same. They get replaced. Okay. The second restriction is that you can't replace anything else, i.e., you can replace only variables that are bound by the quantifier. So suppose we have sum x, fx, and gb. So okay, we say something is such that it's f and Bob is green. And in the conclusion we have Igor is a frog and Bob is green. And that's fine. That follows from the premise. So this is okay. But now, suppose we said sum x, fx, and gb, and then we replaced both the x with an I and the b with an I. This is not okay, because that premise says there's a thing that is like this. It's a frog and Bob is green. Now, is Bob a frog? Who knows? Maybe he is, maybe he's not. The premise doesn't say that he is, but the conclusion says that there's one thing that's both a frog and green. It says that Igor is both a frog and green. Do we know that there are any green frogs? The premise doesn't tell us that, because it says this thing Bob is green, and then there's a frog. And maybe it's the same, there's a green frog, but maybe not. The conclusion doesn't tell us that there's a green frog. The premise doesn't tell us that there's a green frog, but the conclusion does. And so the conclusion is not okay. We don't want to infer from the premise to the conclusion, because the premise can be true without the conclusion being true. The premise can be true if there are no green frogs, but the conclusion is true only if there is a green frog. So, not okay. The last restriction is that all the bound variables are replaced by the same term. So suppose we have for all x, if ox and hx, and then we say we infer on, then hn. So if ostrich is an emu, every ostrich is honorable. So if Nancy is an ostrich, then Nancy is honorable. No problem. We said for all x, if ox and hx, and we inferred if om, then hn, we'd be saying if Mary is an ostrich, then Nancy is honorable. And that's not okay, because again, as with the UI restriction number 1, and the same for EI, the premise says of each thing that if it is an ostrich, then that very same thing is also honorable. But this premise says if one thing is an ostrich, Mary, then a possibly different thing, Nancy, is honorable. And the premise doesn't tell us that, and so we don't want to infer that. So there's similar restrictions on EG. I'm not going to talk about them. The program will, for the most part, stop you from making errors with these binding restrictions, but they help us to understand the rules, and it's important, again, as I said, that you have some understanding of these restrictions so that you when you're trying to use UI and EI, you don't you don't try to do things that aren't going to work. Okay, next video will be about some derived rules.